Today we're focusing on text annotation. Before we really get into annotating the Abigail Adams prompt, we will look back at your soapstone chart on that to make sure that we're all on the same page as far as having a basic understanding of what's happening in the piece. But before we get to that, I do want you to know why we annotate text. This is something that we've done with our multiple choice practice, but it's also something that's even more important to do on the rhetorical analysis. One of the reasons why we annotate our text for rhetorical analysis is because it helps us organize our thoughts and ideas for later use in writing. In the timed situation of the AP exam, you only have 40 minutes to read and annotate the text and write your response. So it's important that when you start writing, you already have some ideas as far as how you want to organize your response, what you want to say, and what evidence you want to use. So what this allows you to do is go ahead and have some direct interaction with yourself and the text before you start writing. So of course you need to know what it is that you need to annotate. Part of this is something that you may already have done last night as you were sorting out how to fill in the chart on Soapstone, because one of the things that you can annotate is, or some of the things you can annotate are patterns. You can annotate patterns that help connect or clarify those parts of Soapstone. Things like speaker and audience are often very straightforward. Like in this piece, it told us in the italicized information that Abigail Adams was the speaker, and it told us that John Quincy Adams was the audience. What we don't get directly told are things like tone and really a complete picture of the purpose. Sometimes a text will give us a little indication of the purpose, but it won't be as thorough as we need to be in our description of purpose. So those are things that we need to make notes about. For example, if we look at the Abigail Adams piece, the introductory information says, well, I guess that's not italicized. I always think it is, but it's not. In the following letter, Abigail Adams writes to her son, John Quincy Adams, who's traveling abroad with his father, John Adams, a United States diplomat and later the country's second president. Read the letter carefully, then, in a well-developed essay, analyze the rhetorical strategies Adams uses to advise her son. So we know she's advising her son, but we don't know what she's advising him to do until we read the text. So that would be an example of where in the instructions, we're giving an indication of what the purpose is, but we're not given the entire purpose. So that would be a reason for needing to annotate further for some of those elements of Soapstone. Another thing that we want to annotate for would be repetition. So we're looking for repetition on multiple levels. The most obvious type of repetition would be the repetition of words or phrases. We want to identify why that repetition exists. We want to be able to explain why the author makes the choice, and we want to analyze how it builds our tone, how it builds context, or how it helps the speaker build their argument. In building argument with repetition or otherwise, the repetition of ideas themselves or the arguments themselves can also be something to annotate for. You might not see the exact same language, but you might see the ideas repeated. So what we want to look at there would be those first and last sentences of paragraphs for repeated ideas or arguments. And that should make sense to you because if you think about your writing, the last sentence of your introduction is your thesis statement where you're really giving your essential argument, and then the beginning of each paragraph you've got a topic sentence, so that's going to repeat an idea that is in your thesis, or at least part of an idea that's in your thesis. And then if you're concluding your paragraphs correctly to transition in and out of those, you'll also see those ideas repeated so that your organization is clear and your reader knows where you're going. So just like you do that in your writing, so do other authors. Another thing to annotate for, and this becomes very important when we think about how to organize our responses to these rhetorical analysis prompts, would be shifts. So we're looking for changes. Those are really, really important. And that might be in tone, it might be in argument, it might be in style, it might be in purpose. So an author might have an overall purpose for the whole piece, but there might be a micro purpose within a paragraph or even within a sentence. So we have to look at the purpose of particular word choices, the purpose of paragraphs, and some of those things might be shifts that we annotate for. Often, tone will help us identify where these changes are happening. We'll see different types of words, different categories of language that help shape the author's tone. So things we want to think about as we're annotating for tone changes might be what the purpose of the change would be and how the tone shapes the message. Is the speaker impassioned? Are they neutral? Are they angry? Are they firm? Are they ambiguous? We have to think about those tone shifts in order to think about how that's going to impact the message. Another thing we would annotate for would be, and this is still in the shift category, would be organization or structure. Does the organization change? Why does it change? And how does it change the outcome? Sometimes it might change, sometimes the content or focus of the text might change, and I think we'll see that pretty clearly in the Abigail Adams piece. We'll use that as a model and identify some changes that take place there for practice, and then later on you'll do one on your own. So in addition to changes in tone, we want to also just be able to annotate for tone in general. Tone is often going to be an element of writing that supports an emotional connection between the speaker and the subject, or the speaker and the audience. Particularly in the case of the Abigail Adams piece, the speaker, subject, and audience are really closely linked because we're talking about a mother-son relationship here. To annotate for tone, we have to identify particular words or phrases that show the author's emotions, and that's going to help us explain the author's emotional attachment to the subject in a more specific way. Things to consider would be how those emotions impact the writing or the message itself, how it adds to the speaker's argument. Does it help them communicate what they're trying to get across? What does it allow them to accomplish? Another thing you might annotate for would be questions that you have as you read. You don't want to necessarily ask a question that would facilitate primarily summary. You want to ask questions that are going to help you thoughtfully analyze the piece. And when we think about thoughtful analysis, we really want to be thinking about purpose. Not what is happening, but why is it happening? Of course, if you have any questions left as you read or anything that confuses you, you want to identify that so that you can think about it and hopefully gain some clarity. And then there might be some unsolvable questions. There might be things that are meant to be left unknown at the end of the text. But if you ask yourself those questions that there are answers for, you may gain clarity on those upon rereading the text and upon analyzing some particular language choices. And of course, if there are things that are very confusing to you in some individual sentences in the text, you don't have to analyze every single word in the piece. So it's okay to still be left with some questions at the end and maybe making a note saying, this is confusing, I don't know what this means. It's just kind of a clue to yourself to kind of skip over that piece when it comes to writing down your analysis in your essay. So the last thing I want to talk about for annotation would be these different categories of rhetorical choices. So authors are making specific choices when it comes to things like syntax, literary devices, imagery, diction, detail, tone, organization, and point of view. You don't necessarily even have to use these particular words in your rhetorical analysis, but certainly you can. These are just kind of categories of choices that authors make. So if they're making a choice about syntax, we're going to be looking at identifying and discussing effective sentence structure or different sentence structure or varied sentence structure, shifts in sentence structure, repetition in sentence structure. So still those shifts and repetition are things that we're looking for. Where it says IDAD here, that just means identify and discuss, and I just wrote that there so I didn't have to type it out every single time. If you see a particularly short sentence in the midst of a bunch of longer sentences, then you're looking at a syntax choice. For literary devices, those are going to be things that you pretty much already know, like metaphor, personification, hyperbole, those sorts of things you've been covering in English classes for years and years. Imagery, I think most of you probably know what that is. That's any language that appeals to the senses. Could be visual, could be auditory, could be tactile, olfactory, or gustatory. A lot of times we think just in terms of visual imagery, but there are other types of imagery that we can look at and that we can analyze. I was reading a rhetorical analysis from another class the other day, and the imagery, it was all sound imagery, and the student writer wrote about how the author created a picture and then described the sound imagery. And that's not really an accurate description of what was happening because the author was not painting a picture. That would be visual imagery. This was auditory imagery. So we describe that in a different way. But it is important to remember that imagery is language that appeals to any of your five senses, not just visual imagery. Authors also are going to make particular choices about diction. So their words might have different denotations and different connotations. Denotation is the dictionary definition, and connotation is sort of the cultural, societal, emotional meaning of a word. And we'll see that in the piece that you guys will analyze as a group probably tomorrow. And there's a really good example of that at the very beginning of a piece called America Needs Its Nerds. So there's a hint for something you can look for in that piece. Also, detail. You want to be able to identify and discuss the concrete aspects of the passage. What is the author giving you specific details about? This is something that I asked you to do in your This I Believe essays, to give really specific details in your narratives, because that can be a really effective rhetorical choice in getting your message across. So just like you had to choose those details specifically, so do these other authors whose writing we're analyzing. Tone, of course, we've already talked about. Organization can play into rhetorical analysis, especially if we think about organization in terms of finding shifts in the piece. Often you will see a beginning, middle, and an end, and that might be how you choose to divide up your examination of a piece. And then the last element here that we're looking at is point of view. What type of perspective the author brings to the topic. Of course, this is something that's going to be important in the Abigail Adams piece because the author is the mother of the audience. So those are really important things to remember.